trying to show you guys. Putting more clear water between these stripes to do my push technique. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I'm gonna work on the ear here. And a lot of times what I do with ears is just to put a delicate first tea consistency wash down first. And as you can see, I'm using a bit of Naphthol red, and I dropped a little Windsor violet in towards the bottom of the ear just to have some variation in the color. And if you look at the reference photo, which I'm not looking at right now, it does have a little variation from pinker to bluish purplish down towards the bottom. And that's true in a lot of cats' ears. You have a nice variation of colors from the top to the bottom of the ear, and that always looks nice if you can capture that with your painting. And so right here I'm working in the darkest area of the inner ear while it's still really wet to keep everything really soft. And I'm using Windsor Violet here and going in with about a consistency of tea or milk in my brush on a somewhat moist paper. You can see the paper is moist because it's spreading out and having nice soft edges. And I did do some masking in this ear already to mask out some of the fur, little hairs in the ear. That little blue spot at the top is some cobalt blue, just to echo what's in the reference photo. And sometimes you can kind of play up colors that are in your reference photo and make them brighter if you want. It depends on the style of painting you want to produce. And I was hoping with this cat to get more glowing colors. I'm using my Royal & Langnickel size 4 Zen brush. And now I'm putting the first wash on the farther back ear. And I'm going in with tea consistency onto dry paper, but this first wash that it has tea consistency paint, and it will serve as the first layer that will allow me to paint wet and wet for the rest of this bit that I'm doing on this ear. And as you can see, the tip of the ear is a little bit pinker, and then as it goes towards his head, it segued nicely into some burnt sienna and quinacridone gold. So I'm trying to do that more and more with every area I paint, to not keep it one flat color, but to have some nuances and change of color. Like say from the front to the back of the cat, the front of the cat's going to be warmer and the back of the cat's going to be cooler. The tip of the ear is pink, and down towards the top of the head, it goes down, washes down into a burnt sienna. And that's just going to create more interesting shapes and passages in your painting if you can vary the color in each area that you're working in. I'm just going to go back in and work on these stripes, and I'm doing a little bit of lifting here by having clear water, and I'm adding some clear water to the stripes and just kind of nitpicking. And I'm lifting some paint out from under this black stripe with a brush that is full of clear water, and then I'm wringing the water out of that brush and then going back in and lifting out some color. All right, so I'm just putting in this background wash. I've got a combination of cerulean blue and ultramarine blue, a little bit of Windsor violet, and I also used some quinacridone gold and burnt sienna to kind of dull down my colors just a little bit. But right here, I'm just painting up against the edge of the cat's face just to kind of map it in and get my feelers out for where everything's going to be. where all my edges are going to be, so that then I can go back in later and paint more freely, because I'll have that first little map down of where I'm going to put color and where I'm going to keep really white. And remember, when you're painting a dark passage against a completely white passage, like right here against the face, just remember, this is where people are going to scrutinize your whites. So I had a teacher tell me once, remember, wherever you put your whites, make sure that those edges are refined. If it's a jagged edge, like this cat has it looks like an eyelash sticking out, so I made sure I got that in. And you really want to get those white edges that smack up against a dark edge. You want to get them the correct shape and as much variation in the line as possible. So instead of having like his face go like this, I'm trying to put in a few little jagged edges that show the eyelashes coming out, and just putting in as many interesting details in those whites as possible. I was just basically, for the background part, just kind of washing in some color, getting that first wash for the background in, and keeping it really soft. So in this bottom left corner right now, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to balance out all this blue in the background by putting a mix of burnt sienna and quinacridone gold in. And once I got it done, I can just tell you guys what I was thinking as I was painting this. I remember I was like, that doesn't really look good. But later sessions, I paint over a lot of that and really tone down the yellow. So it came out okay. Okay, so here I just put in a combination of indigo blue and some cobalt blue in the background, and I'm just putting in more colors. I'm just dropping in. I'm trying to keep, as you can see, the colors, I'm trying to keep them varied. So that indigo blue is a really nice grayish blue. So later I'll use this even thicker against the white of his face to really pop the white of his face. But at this stage in the background, I'm just keeping it really soft and loose and kind of quiet, just to support the cat. So in this clip, I'm working on the cat's face. And what I like to do for these little dots here, I like to get the paper just the right amount of moistness, where it's just a little softly wet, but it's not glistening wet, so that when you put in those little dots for where the whiskers meet the face, they kind of spread out softly, but not too much, because it's a tiny area. So your paper has to be just the right moistness. And you might want to practice first before you do it. But first I went in with a little wash of tea consistency burnt sienna and quinacridone gold. And then I went in and dropped in a dark. It could be lamp black, it could be a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, whatever you want to use for the really dark little spots where the whiskers go into the face. And just make sure your paper is a little wet, just a little tiny bit of damp, so that those whisker holes spread out and stay soft, but not too much so they spread too far, because it's just a very small little detail. And while I'm at it, and I have it a little bit, just barely wet, I put in his mouth. And so that kept that line really soft, even a tiny bit softer than in the reference photo. And that almost always that looks good. You really can't go wrong working in on paper that is just a tiny bit wet. And then for the nose hole, of course, that has to be pretty much completely dry. So right there, the paper is completely dry when I put in his nose hole and his little nose details here. And I'm using my Simply Simmons size 0 rigger. It's a great brush for this tiny little detail work, because it's stiff enough that it doesn't flop when you do the tiny little detail, but it's just got a really nice little tiny point on it for these little details. And then I got more of the nose area here wet when I was dropping in some of his coloring on his nose right here, and used a combination of burnt sienna quinacridone gold. That quinacridone gold is really a colorful color. I really like it, but I had to kind of dial it back when I first started using it in this painting because it was looking almost neon. So I'm used to using quinacridone gold deep. And then I decided I wanted to try just quinacridone gold, and that color is a lot more neon, aka more saturated. So here I'm just putting in more burnt sienna and probably a little bit of a mix of ultramarine blue in these cooler areas that are in shadow from his nose, from the light creating a shadow on his nose. And then I'm going ahead and putting in the little eye corner there and connecting this all together as much as possible. And right there, I painted the pinker area of the corner of his eye with naphthol red and burnt sienna with a tea consistency paint on my brush. And I'm just getting in the little details. I'm kind of mapping things in. I'm sure I'll go back later to refine this. I almost always do, but I like to get in the little details of the eye just to map them in so I know where I'm going in my next painting sessions. And then he had a really sharp dark line. It's almost like eyeliner, but it's ear liner, and I really like it. It really makes his ear pop, so I wanted to make sure I got that little ear liner really dark in this cat. You don't really see ear liner in cats much, but this cat had that, so I really thought that was a nice little detail that's really going to make his ears pop. Okay, so for his eyes I used Winsor green gold, permanent green, a little bit of cerulean, and his eyes are really light in the reference photo. I'll probably green them up a little bit and make them more colorful in the painting. So I'm getting this whole background wet with clear water before I go in, and I'm going in really carefully against the edge of the white edge of his forehead and nose to really make sure that I keep all those details crisp and interesting. And then I'm just going in and kind of playing around and not having too much of a plan and just putting in different colors and making the background interesting with a lot of different colors. And the colors that I used, especially, look how bright that yellow is. That's quinacridone gold down there in the left corner. And when I got that down, I was like, I hate that. So here, I'll show you what it looks like now that I've painted a bunch over it. So that's where it's going. But at the time I was like, wow. But I toned it down a ton later with some blue washes over it. But I'm using a lot of bright, pure color right here just to get in the first few washes of the background, keeping it really loose and just kind of playing with color, not taking it too seriously and just letting it flow, letting the paint do its thing, and it granulated out beautifully. That's one of the things about cerulean blue. I used a lot of cerulean blue when I was painting this part of the background, and you can see right now how beautifully it's granulating out. So I really like that. And then the green in there is just some of the green mixed from my palette. It doesn't really matter. You can mix some cobalt blue with some quinacridone gold. It'll give you a pretty green. And I've got a lot of ultramarine blue in this background too. And then when I thought it was looking a little too bright, so I started adding some indigo, and then later I'll add even more indigo. And I'm really liking indigo. I used to not use it at all, but I think I'm going to start making a place for indigo on my palette because it's kind of like cerulean. You add it to colors to kind of gray them down to bring the tone down. That's a new thing that I've clarified in my mind. Tone is how saturated in color something is. Value is the lightness and darkness. And then hue is a little bit different. It's like the color family that color is in. So those are three different words that would be useful for you to learn as an artist. Just going in and putting the darkest darks in the corner of his eye. Here I'm using a Winsor & Newton Series 7 Sable size 0 brush. So I got some of his face wet in his cheek area, and I'm just adding little passages of color where he's got a little bit of highlights in his cheekbones, giving him a little kitty blush, and getting some of these darker areas of fur in, and I'm painting on dry paper in some of these areas, and sometimes I'm using the side of my brush to kind of swoosh it across the top of the paper to kind of get a rough textured look, and that's good for some fur areas. So that's what I was doing in his upper eye area, right about in here, and going back in and adding my darks and just trying to bring definition to his face. And as that area in his cheek dried, I go back in to put in more controlled stripes, but you can see that the paper is still a nice little bit of wet, so that it softens out and spreads out just right. And right there I did a little dot thing, and that's another thing. If your paper's completely dry and you go in and you paint, say, a line, and then you go back over, you can go tap, 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 tap on that line, and it'll kind of mush it down into the paper and soften the edge just so it looks a little bit less pasted on and more painterly. So that's another little trick that you can do, and it can help your edges look a little bit softer. And I'm just going in with the darkest darks in his little corner of his ear, and I am working on slightly moist paper, just a little bit of moist, because I wanted this area super dark, but I did not want the eye to be completely drawn to it. I wanted it to be soft, so I did moisten it just a tiny little bit, and then went in with a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna black mix that I use, and put in those nice darks in those areas and kept them really soft. That one's probably ready to pick.
This one is lit.